Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Great to see so many of you here. We thought we'd break up your week for you and do this on a Wednesday lunchtime. So on that, if you do need to eat your lunch, please feel free. We run this as a very sort of informal session, so please, feel free to eat away whilst we're talking. The main thing is really to be involved in the discussion and the conversation that we're about to have. So just by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Wood, the Director of Consulting Services here at Brockhurst Consulting. And Tom and I, by way of background, Tom and I established Brockhurst Consulting back in 2016 out of our strong desire to really facilitate more positive workplaces. So where everyone feels safe and respected, have opportunities to develop and grow and really feel fulfilled in their work. So I will be handing you over to Tom in a minute, who will be taking you through the session today. And then Sarah Austin, our Director of Learning Design, is also here with us, and she will close off the session at 1 o'clock today. We can move on to the next slide, please, Tom. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from wherever you are joining us from today. For us, it is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be here with us today. And we thank the traditional custodians for caring for country for thousands of generations and acknowledge that their land was never ceded. So we would like this session to be as interactive as possible. We'd like you to share your experiences as we go through the conversation. So please put your questions either in the Q&A, we've enabled both that, and also the chat. There'll be plenty of opportunity to put your thoughts, experiences, comments in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through. But also, if you want to just take yourself off mute anytime and chip into the conversation, please do that as well. It's all about sharing and having an interactive discussion here. We will be recording the session, so afterwards you will receive a copy of the recording, and also some additional resources about what we're covering today will be sent out to you as well. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Tom.
Thank you, Sarah. I just thought I'd like to start with a story which really ignited Sarah Wood and my passion around this particular topic, which more broadly is late career transition. We were asked by one of our clients, a national stock agent, to help with some conversation with one of their regional managers. This gentleman at the time was 70 years old. He was not talking about retirement. The business was getting quite worried about his well-being. He was doing long road trips, multi-day road trips. He had significant relationships in the region which were held by him only, and he was actually blocking the development of, I'm going to say, the younger workers in that office, who many of them are over 50. They were concerned, or they didn't really know how to start that conversation. This is 10 years ago. So they asked me to get involved. So I went out and met the gentleman, and we started talking, and it took quite a while of coaching conversations and really listening and being with him to get him to acknowledge that, his only strategy was he's going to retire in 5 years at 75, and he had really nothing more than that. No one really knew what that meant. So the effort involved in turning him around to think, yeah, look, it's probably worth planning to retire in 5 years rather than just waiting and thinking about it then. And that was the pivotal point in the coaching relationship that we had. The planning bit was actually easy once we'd got him interested in that process. He did end up retiring.
Raquel's mum is French, or she's Belgian.
Oh, sorry? Okay, so he did end up retiring well. The clients and the knowledge was transferred back into the organisation, And what I took out of this and brought back to Sarah and to Brockhurst Consulting was that there's a real interesting juxtaposition there around the organisations having these conversations with late career people, and there's a barrier there to actually starting the conversation. But once they've started, the process is an awful lot easier. So we have a framework that's been widely used for that transitional process. Today's about actually getting to the point of having the conversation about that framework. So what I'd like to ask you all is to just share with Sarah Wood and Sarah Austin and I about who you are and why you are here. In any particular order, can you engage in the chat and let us know if you're in HR or you manage people, so you're supporting people managers or you are a person manager. If you've had a conversation about late career planning recently and how it may have gone. If you're planning a conversation about a late career situation and what's on your mind about that, or perhaps you're even avoiding a conversation. So if I could ask everybody to put their coffee down and their sandwich down, lean forward, grab onto the keyboard and give us a bit of a hint about what's going on for you and why you're all here. What we will be doing after this webinar is consolidating all the comments in the chat, de-identifying and aggregating them, but we'll be sharing back with everybody who's registered and attended so that you'll actually be able to see what everybody else is thinking. So it's a bit of a knowledge sharing process going on here today. It's not just about what we think. We're really hopeful that you'll all have ideas and thoughts. And if you disagree with something we're saying, that's great. Let's put that out there and have a conversation. We haven't got heaps of time today, but it'll certainly start a dialogue and it'll be a rich source to move forward with. So I can see Laura works in HR and supports managers to have these conversations. Thanks, Laura. In L&D, and curious about how late career conversations should be hosted and the collective wisdom on how to do this effectively. Thanks, Sally. That's why we're here. And Sarah Wood and Sarah Austin will be tracking the chat as we go through and calling me out on anything that we need to touch base on, or they might jump in and answer some questions along the way too. As Sarah Wood said, it's a very informal session we've got here today. It's really a conversation sharing with you our experiences and our thought processes around the legislation and the frameworks. But the more you contribute, the richer this hour will be.
I can see, Chris, that you've got a number of staff in your workforce that are approaching that later stage of their career. So good to hear you're looking into a more proactive program of engagement. Absolutely. Yeah. And
sorry about the movement. I've just noticed my computer wasn't charging. Now it is.
And Elisa, yeah, acknowledging that sensitivity of these conversations and how challenging they can be. So that's exactly, again, what we're going to be looking at today, perhaps understanding a bit more about why they're so challenging and how we can perhaps overcome that to get the conversation started.
So please keep contributing into the chat, even if it's not an overt time to do so. We'll keep on going, getting through the slides. But the more, as I said a few times, the more you contribute, the richer these conversations will be. So just being really clear about what we're here for today, and I guess I'm stating some obvious facts, is that we know all of us will eventually move away from full-time work. Change theory and our experience also shows us that completely stopping from a Friday night full-time work to Monday nothing is more often than not unhealthy for the individual, and more often than not it leaves the organisation wanting for wisdom transfer and continuity. We also know that when people are given an opportunity to work differently, whether it be flexibly or part-time or changing of jobs, they're nearly always interested in working longer. And what I mean by that is into a later age, not more hours per week. So people who can work differently will nearly always work longer. Later stage career planning, in our experience, helps the person and the company. The person is given time to plan for a sustainable life beyond full-time work, and the company is given time to draw back that wisdom, essentially. Starting those conversations early makes a big difference to how these conversations end up. So the longer you've got to think through this and normalize this and get away from that fear response, the better these conversations happen and the more options become available. What we are not here to talk about today, although it's certainly a webinar that we've done in the past and we can do it again, is the process of managing those mature age employees through that multi-year period when they do decide to leave. I guess another point I'd like to make is the R word, and this notion of retirement is fundamentally different to what it used to be. And my father retired. He worked and then he stopped. And most people of past generations did that. We're framing, and so if I slip the word retirement in, it's unintentional. We're really trying to be quite intentional about talking about late career planning and late career transition, which is a much more organic process than retiring. So at the end of this session, we'd like you to think that with a little effort, you can make a big difference to the way late career conversations are managed at your work. We'd like you to feel quite optimistic about taking some of these ideas back to your workplace and socialising to start this change process, just having conversations. There's not going to be big formal policies developed today, but we just want to start the conversation. So what we'd like you to do is actually make time, go back and talk to someone about this, share with them the ideas that you've heard and discuss what's going on next. So start the conversation to normalise it in the organisation and get the conversation going. Some ABS statistics, and this was really quite surprising to me. I won't go into all the details there. The links there, we'll be sharing the slides with you so you can, or we're showing the presentation with you, you can look them up. But the intended retirement age is actually going down year on year. People are intending to retire younger. Before I'd read these stats a couple of weeks ago, my logic said everyone's going to be planning to work later, but this is what the ABS says. They also say that 9.6% of the current workforce, so nearly 1 in 10 people in your workforce at least, are intending to retire in the next 5 years. So I'm going to talk a bit about the ageing context, and then I'm going to ask for a little bit of feedback from you. Share with you our view on the ageing context. So if we think about very simply life in 2 dimensions, how long we live, longevity, and the quality of our life, vitality. So that's sort of the basis of where these ideas come from. Now, around about the turn of last century, the retirement age was set at 65. At that point, the average life expectancy of an Australian male was 68. So if we assumed we were born with an average vitality, our life would look something like this, down to that point there. And this little bit in here represents retirement. So you can see that we didn't need a lot of money. We didn't need a lot of planning and a lot of time to fill up that little area under the graph there. Now, what's been going on is that over the last couple of centuries, every year our life expectancy has been going up. If you are 60 years old today or thereabouts, you've got a better than 50% chance of living into your 90s. Our children, or my children, have got a better than 50% chance of living into their hundreds. So that's a significant, consistent shift. I believe at some point it should taper out. In addition, because of increased nutrition, increased education, increased health services, I suggest that we're actually being born with and live with a greater vitality, a greater standard of living, and we stay young longer. So our life curve looks a bit more like that, a little bit steeper and certainly a lot longer. We also know from the ABS that the intended retirement age is dropping a little bit. So let's just leave it where it is for now, a little bit earlier. This area is now what we look at from a traditional retirement perspective. So an awful lot bigger. Of course, you need more money, and you need to think about that a lot more about what am I going to do for all of those 30 years and with all of this energy and vitality to burn up. I also mentioned earlier that we know that the bigger a change is and the faster it is, the harder it happens. So we've got this sort of shock wave here, if you like, about, I'm out of work and I've got 30 years left and what's going on. So what we know, what we've been thinking about is to try and blur that line a little bit. So we think about what are we doing as we're leading up with all this extra energy and we know there's more time prior to that, let's stop full-time work. But what can we do afterwards? Now, the framework we've developed sits in here, right, which is starting from 5 days a week down to 1 day a week over a few years. As I said, we're not going through that today. But the earlier we start this conversation with our employees about what are you thinking for this period here, and what are you thinking for this period here, until at some point you won't be doing anything. But let's get those conversations happening earlier to help combat this massive change in the reality of retirement. Yeah, any thoughts, anybody? Emergency services in the focus on retire to something rather than the retire from. Yes, thanks, Jennifer. That's a conversation I've had a couple of times about, what are you going to, not what are you leaving? It's really relevant in a whole career conversation as well. It is a long time to have a third career, absolutely. That's the point. We've got a lot of time, we've got a lot of vitality, and let's have conversations to make sure that that's used in a very fulfilling way. And the graph's gone, but there's an awful lot of time there to do that transfer piece as well. Yeah, that was my intuition as well. And I think we can take and thanks for bringing that up, Laura, about, a pushback on the Bureau of Statistics. I'm hearing that also. And I think that it's really interesting to push and prod at the realities that we're hearing and the facts that we're hearing. What I am sure about is that it's a movable feast here, but the focusing on these conversations and normalising these conversations to help people navigate is necessary, regardless of if they might be working in a way that they're not happy with, and they might implode. So let's have these conversations so that they can stick around longer because of the cost of living pressures. What I'd like to put to you now is thinking about the average age of going back to the stats that we said that about 9.6 of the workforce are planning to retire in the next 5 years. And our experience, Brockhurst Consulting's experience, is there's a lack of in-depth, robust conversations around planning for that. And I'd like you to let me know if you are doing those planning sessions, which would be wonderful. But what do you know the average age of your workforce? And what is the impact of those mature people leaving without any planning? What's the impact to you as an organisation? And also, what's the impact to them in your view? So if you could share some thoughts, that'd be terrific. 40 to 50%, 40 or 50 is average age. Impact of people leaving without planning could be loss of organisational knowledge. Yep, subject matter experts. Generally older workforce, 20 years tenure. Yep, that's pretty significant. But across portfolio roles, so there's a broad requirement. There's a broad reliance on all of our employees, particularly the ones with 20 years experience. What we're going to do now is share with you there's any number of reasons why these conversations are difficult to start. But Sarah and I have been talking about the conversations we've been having with our clients and the market. We've come up with 4 that we think covers the bases. But if anything else comes out while you're hearing what we talk about, please drop it into the chat and we'll capture it later. The first one we're talking about is assumption-based barriers. So making assumptions based on, what we think someone will be thinking, making assumptions based on water cooler conversations or what we would be doing in that situation or what our parents did. So rather than checking at the source, assuming what people are doing, and we've got a little avatar that we'll talk about with that. We've got 4 stories to unpack these points. The second one that's very common is concerns about violating age discrimination laws, which is absolutely we need to be concerned about that and think about that. The third point is that most of the organisations we talk to haven't really explored and don't really understand the breadth of late career options that there are. They've got a limited perspective on that. And finally, it's the head in the sand. They don't fear of negative outcomes. I don't want to start talking about these late career conversations because I don't want people to leave.
I'm seeing that conversation or the comment there from Laura about people having a very strong identity with their organisation, having had a long tenure. And so that sounds like it may also be a challenging kind of context in which to raise these conversations when there's such a high level of identification to the organisation and to the sort of work type role. Or is that the case with you in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got very strong identity to the organisation and the type of work that they do. And that often results sometimes in the head in the sand approach, where, it's actually the staff that don't want to have conversations about it.
Right, yeah.
Good point, thank you. Yeah, there are 2 people in this conversation, aren't there? We've got to get the staff to come around, which is like that first story I told you about, the gentleman that didn't want to face it. All right, so let's, I'm going to tell you a story. So these 4 stories we're going to tell you are based on our experiences, but we've de-identified them and aggregated a few different stories into one to make a mythical character so that nobody gets called out and nobody, we're not violating anyone's privacy. So at Robinson and Partners, one of Sydney's major law firms, there was a big tender coming in and a big job coming into the organisation, and Carol, who had been there for 25 years, was overlooked by the managing partner. They assumed because her husband had just sold his accountancy practice in Brisbane that she'd be doing the same thing too. In reality, she'd been actively pursuing growing her part of the practice and recently completed an international business certification. And it wasn't until it popped up in a partners meeting where she came and said, look, I've passed my course. Oh, I've got some ideas to make this grow. That the managing partners realised that they'd missed out on an opportunity to engage her wisdom and expertise in a very big opportunity. With her fresh certifications being really relevant to growing the business, she would have been ideal for that project. And as a result, the project lost a bit of its zing, and Margaret felt fairly disenfranchised and lost a lot of her energy as well. So the key message here is that the assumptions that the leadership made about somebody and about their retirement lost them out on valuable expertise and the potential to grow. So making assumptions is very dangerous. So what can we do about this, and what was the advice that came out of the conversations debriefing that event? Was not to listen to hearsay and gossip, not to make assumptions based on indirect information or rumours. Because someone's saying, oh, well, so-and-so's husband's just sold their practice, doesn't mean anything. It means you've got to go and have these conversations and hear it straight from the horse's mouth. The other part of this is about being aware of our own age-based unconscious biases, and we all have them. What your parents did probably won't reflect what your staff want to do. What you'd like to do in a certain context doesn't mean that's what your staff would like to do. But it's really easy to make those decisions and avoid a difficult conversation because you think it's not necessary. Does anybody have any comments or thoughts or tips they'd like to share at this point for the overlooked legal partner?
Just want to add here, Tom, as well. Sometimes recency or bias might come into effect as well. You know, we might have heard some recent stories about what happened with someone or their approach to something, and because they're stories that we remember most easily because they've happened, you know, within the last short memory space, we sometimes hold on to them as more truthful and or generalize them, I guess, into general facts.
Thanks, Sarah. And Jill, critical to also remember others are rewatching and might make decisions in line with that.
Same idea, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, other employees are watching what's happening to their colleagues or with their colleagues, and might, you know, sort of pick up a signal that, you know, people might be assuming that I'm also at that age level, so maybe I should start to plan my exit because I can see that, you know, the organisation didn't value this other person. I think you called Carol.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're sending
I think
very strong signals that they'll interpret. So without
That's
those
right.
conversations, the assumptions will carry.
Yeah, actions are louder than words, right?
Absolutely. But this is about making words actions, isn't it? Have the conversation. Don't make the assumptions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So let's go to another example where this one's called the hesitant health coordinator. So a busy community health centre in Western Sydney, Sarah kept putting off an important conversation with Betty, her 61-year-old community outreach coordinator, who'd spent 2 decades building trust with the local families. Despite needing to discuss succession planning, Sarah worried about the legal implications of any conversation that might be perceived as age discrimination. We can't risk thinking Betty was pushed out, or Betty thinking she's pushed out, because that would really damage our standing in the community. As Sarah delayed the conversation, kept pushing it back and back and back, new problems grew. The newer health workers weren't being introduced into the clients. The established procedures weren't being documented. And Betty's vital connections with the local community were continuing to remain without a transition plan. So avoiding having the conversation because of the fear of the legislation actually created much bigger problems, much bigger longitudinal problems. Look, unknowingly, Betty had been hoping to move into a less than permanent role, hoping to take on a mentoring role and document planning, document procedures and hand over the clients. So there's a real missed opportunity to capture what the employee wanted to do, what Ruth wanted to do, Betty, sorry, I got my names wrong here, and pull that out so that we could have had a much more smooth transition, all because we were afraid of the legal ramifications. So as an example, the outcomes are fairly similar, but because of the legal ramifications, I'd like you to think about, what does that mean for me? Because we've done some research and it is a fairly nebulous field, but basically you cannot discriminate against someone because of their age. And having an effective, a regular discussion with staff at all stages will normalise this conversation. A simple professional discussion about career planning does not constitute discrimination. It's really easy. We find it easy. Our customers find it normal to have these conversations with graduates and early career employees. But that interest tapers off as people mature. But they don't need to. We've seen in the graph, we've seen in the reality that there's a lot more time to spend, a lot more work to be done. So taking the same approach to employees at all stages makes a big difference. This is about organisations having a limited perspective on late career options. And there's a missed opportunity here in the APS. So basically we've got Ms. Wells, who's a 58-year-old civil servant. She's got 25 years of distinguished service. In fact, recently ministers were lauding the work she was doing on some major infrastructure projects. What happened is when she started talking about retirement, the director threw up his hands and said, well, that's it. I'll start making a statement saying, you know, Ms. Wells is leaving now. And we drafted the documentation and presented her the retirement plan and the superannuation. It was all done and dusted, and Ms. Wells accepted the process and ended up retiring. What became apparent in the exit interview is that Ms. Wells said, well, I was really hoping to go 3 days and I wanted to set up a training program and doing some mentor programs with the younger workers. But it was pretty clear to me that it was just all or nothing. So I'm gone. It wasn't really apparent to the agency until about 6 months later, when some junior staff were really tackling with a big infrastructure project, that they realised that the wealth of knowledge and the ability to mentor the younger workers was actually gone. So that expertise and training potential was a very missed opportunity. The key message here was that real and perceived, and often they're perceived, rigid structures forced out valuable experience that could have been retained. On debriefing this conversation, we talked about and found out that there are actually quite a lot of options that could have been brought up prior to that event, prior to that employee leaving. And here's a list of ones that we've come up with when we're working with the APS and other organisations, looking at part-time roles, thinking about jobs sharing, invoking the remote work options, which is so easy to do nowadays, phasing in retirement, having flexible hours or compressed weeks, giving extended leave, customising work arrangements, putting projects in place, establishing mentor roles and skilling up and training roles. Does any of that resonate with anybody? Has this happened with you? I've got any thoughts? Is any of this, you know, thinking something you might be able to take back?
Tom, I just got a request today from someone who is looking to decrease their days and pick up some slightly different duties as part of that part-time role.
Wonderful.
I dare say this is prompted by the conversation that you led with our team, and it's given people pause for thought on both sides, the employee and the management team, to think about how we can, I guess, best manage and everyone benefit. And that's, I think, where we've landed, that actually both the organisation and the individual are going to benefit from adopting this approach.
Oh, well, thanks for sharing, Jill. And I think that's really encouraging to hear. So for the benefit, as Jill shared, we did some work with Jill's organisation and normalised and started the conversation about thinking about this transition from full-time to part-time and less than full-time work. And case in point, by normalising and making it permissible and normal to actually think about things a little bit differently with some of the options that are up on the screen, there's a win-win. Someone gets to work differently but longer. The organisation gets to retain some wisdom, set up a slightly different work routine and get some different work done, which is for the benefit of the longevity of the organisation and also helps this person transition more fulfillingly.
The other component of that, sorry, I'll just quickly add, Tom, is just access to additional leave during that time as well, because in this particular situation, the partner of the employee is actually now in the process of separating from work completely, and so this new arrangement with all of those different components actually supports both the individual and their partner to achieve the outcomes that they're looking for.
Oh,
so
that's
thank
so
you.
good to hear. So were there any, that's lovely, it's a great story. What were the challenges systemically or from an organisational perspective to make that happen?
Look, I think you know, back to your point earlier, there were some assumptions being made about what that person wanted.
Yeah.
And so I think us having that broader conversation and being prompted to actually have those conversations with individuals was really helpful, because it kind of gave permission on both sides for those conversations to happen. So I think actually having the conversation really allowed us to sort of surface all the ideas that we had and get clear on what the individual was after. And so, you know, very quickly we moved beyond the idea that that person was actually wanting to step out of the organisation, but actually was looking to make a sort of slow transition to retirement.
Fantastic. What you didn't say then, and I'm encouraged by that, but there weren't policies in the way. So talking about extended leave, talking about part-time, talking about job share, was that all? Did you have to create the permissions for that, or was that already there? Someone was using it.
It was already there, but I think what it gave us an opportunity to do was to sort of amplify the fact that those things were there and that it was all possible, and that the, you know, the policies allowed for all of those options. But there were no sort of barriers as such, but perhaps a perception that those things weren't possible.
Thank you, and that's
particularly the additional, having access to additional leave.
Yeah, lovely. That's what we find regularly, is that when you go and look at the awards and the instruments, permissions are there. We just haven't known about them, and no one really knows how to use them. Jennifer Burgess, we've also purchased.
Tom, can I just, I think Laura and Jennifer have raised another key issue here, which is obviously the financial impact of going part-time, which obviously we need to acknowledge as well. And I was just going to share that from our work with universities, that universities do tend to offer a pretty amazing pre-retirement arrangement, whereby actually, even though people can gradually reduce their time fraction, they actually maintain their super as if they are still actually working full-time. Now, obviously, that option is probably not going to be financially viable for a lot of organisations, but that has really helped with that sort of workforce planning from both the organisations and the university's point of view, but also from the individual employee's point of view, to have that arrangement in place, so that it removes that fear of, oh, well, what's this going to mean financially for me as I'm approaching retirement, losing out because I'm going part-time. So I think it's a factor that obviously part-time arrangements winding down is very much an option, but I think we do have to acknowledge that often comes with it, with organisations and for individuals, that implication or the impact on the financial situation.
Thank you, Sarah, and absolutely, that's the reality. And you know, what we don't do at Brockhurst is the financial planning part of this process, but it's fundamental. But
it sounds like these Laura's and Jennifer's organisations have also thought about that, and they're thinking about where you can use your long service leave or your purchase leave as well. So that's really good to hear.
Excellent. All right, we'll get into the last reason that we've identified, which is the fear of negative outcomes. You know, if I start this conversation, they'll leave. So there was a manufacturing organisation that we worked with, and Michael was one of the production managers, and he was their highest performer. He led a really great team. He was the most experienced, consistently achieved top metrics on quality and output and throughput. And the HR manager was starting to be concerned about Michael's age and thinking through, you know, the long-term workforce planning, and kept putting off that conversation because she was worried that if she started the conversation with Michael, he'd say, oh, yeah, that's right, I'd like to leave now. And what happened, because Michael was getting frustrated because he had ideas about developing training programs, improving the documentation and putting in new systems, he felt like he was being ignored and no one was interested in what he had to say. What ended up happening is that a competitor approached Michael and offered him a job with flexible hours, taking on mentoring, training and documentation roles, which he took. And he actually took 3 of the team leaders along with him. So the fear of the negative outcome was actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. If that conversation had occurred earlier, then Michael would have loved to have stayed where he was, but he just didn't know that was on the table. So avoiding those conversations, you know, can actually precipitate people leaving when they're the ones that you really don't want to leave. So there's no really new tips here, because the main tips are start the conversations early. There's a little quote here that I've been using for a long time, which is, the nicest thing about not planning is that failure comes as a complete surprise and is not preceded by a period of worry and depression. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to worry about it till it happens, but if you plan for it, you can mitigate lots of negative outcomes. There's a couple of things that popped up in the chat.
One thing I just wanted to pick up that Elisa has mentioned earlier on was, you know, the fear of negative outcomes might also be what, you know, when you want to have the conversation, but the person themselves don't acknowledge their age or their situation in life or the stage in life, and sort of having those conversations. Sometimes the fear of negative outcomes might be the fear of a bad reaction to the conversation. So thanks for bringing that up, Elisa. You have any thoughts on that, Tom?
I do. So I've used the word normalizing a lot, and I've also mentioned that, you know, we as in HR and company managers and owners find it quite normal to have career conversations with graduates and early careers. Where do you want to be in 5 years? What do you want to do? What's your next 3 jobs? You know, what are you learning? What are you developing? We know how to have these conversations. We just seem to stop when people get to a certain age. So by normalizing the conversations, by having ritualized or systemized career conversations on a regular basis with everyone, creates the space for people not to be fearful, because it's not, the intent isn't. I mean, there are always people where there's problems and they should be working elsewhere. But what we're trying to normalize here is, if you have conversations, if you have structured, intentional conversations about the next 5 to 10 years with anyone, then it opens up the scope to plan for those conversations. I think Jill mentioned earlier that people are watching what you're doing. I mean, absolutely. So if you're ignoring people, then they're watching that. But if you're talking to people, they're watching that too. So this is a cultural change, if you like. This is about shifting the dial a little bit and to start normalizing these conversations so that they're not fearful. It's not one webinar, it's not one conversation, but chipping away at that piece is my reaction to that. Do you have anything to add, Sarah Wood or Sarah Austin?
Only that often, you know, organisations will have performance development kind of conversations, and even if you don't have career conversations with your teams, it can always be an opportunity to sort of raise, you know, professional development in the context of, you know, how you wanting to continue to grow your skills, your capabilities, etc., and doing it in the context of those conversations is just as valid as doing it, you know, in the context of a 5 to 10 year kind of conversation.
Absolutely. And I think Laura Jennifer's popped in the chat. This is not necessarily a late career problem. Any manager not appreciated is at risk of moving. So that sort of, to me, bolts in with, have these conversations with everyone on a regular basis. Normalizes the late career ones, but it protects the whole work. It's a good, healthy, what do you want to be doing next conversation.
And I think, Tom, just to add to that, like, I know we're focusing on one end of the career sort of spectrum, but I think the younger generations coming into the workforce, this is more and more an expectation for them. They'll be asking for these conversations if you're not even offering them, you know.
Yep, completely.
So I think it's going to become more and more, those whole career conversations are going to be absolutely critical at every stage.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm just watching the time here, flicking onto those avatars that we use, those stories that we aggregated. The point we are trying to help you with is there's some pretty common key issues and preventable outcomes. So the key issues are that we make assumptions based on people's age all the time. We're afraid of legislation. Typically there's a lack of proactive career discussions as people mature. We're missing out on opportunities for the new flexibility that's available, and we're losing institutional knowledge. So the things that are really preventable here is that loss of expertise, that experienced staff leaving, mentoring. I reckon that should be on the top of the list. The ability to create space for people to mentor the younger generations is so underutilised. Means we don't get the knowledge transfer, and we end up with business disruption that's potentially unnecessary. I'm just waiting a sec because Chris is not typing. So that's where we've left, where we're leaving the conversation is about what's going on with why are these conversations difficult? What can we do about them? You'll get the recording and you'll get all the notes. So hopefully we've given you some food for thought. Hopefully it's been an interesting conversation over your sandwich. I'm going to put you on to, are you ready to go with this, Sarah Austin? I know you've had a busy morning.
So what we've often done with organisations is once you've been able to kick off these conversations, we work with those individuals to support them around, what does this transition sort of space kind of look like for you, and get them really thinking about their life and the conversations they kind of need to have about that. So the 4 key areas that we tend to look at with them are, how your identity, which was one of the key things I think someone spoke about earlier around, your professional identity being really strong part of your whole identity, and how that might shift and change as a result of you transitioning to a different type of lifestyle, etc. What routines do you need to create? Because work does give us a natural routine for the way in which we carry on our day-to-day lives, and in the absence of that routine can offer a really safe way to transition and understand what else we might be able to do to support ourselves post-retirement. Networking, we have a massive network of people that we are exposed to when we're in workplaces, and often that will change quite dramatically because some people may not be retiring who we were normally associating with on a day-to-day basis, and so access to those people may diminish. And then finally, the health and wellbeing side of it. So we've come into organisations to start initiating conversations around this, say for lunch and learns, or giving organisations the opportunity to raise these things by inviting people to come and just see what this is all about. And that sometimes helps to instigate some of these conversations, or alternatively, we come in when those conversations have started already. Tom, anything to add to that?
No, I think you've covered it. Thank you, Sarah. That's the next phase of once the conversations have happened, there's a framework, there's a structure. And we'll share you this slide so you can have a think about that. But it's, 4 minutes to go. We were sort of pretty intentional on just focusing on the barriers to have these conversations today. But just know that there's more there when you need it. So,
and thanks, Chris, for mentioning Bridges model. I love that too. Dealing with the endings first before you get to the new beginnings, and often you may well have to be working with people around, okay, I need to come to terms with, this is going to be a different phase. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Chris.
Thank you.
Next. So we will send a link to the recording for today for those who would like to share this with others. We'll obviously provide a summary of the chat as well with your ideas and tips. So thank you very much, everyone, for sharing that. De-identified, so that's safe for you to share. And we'll also share our mature age transition framework that we've just shown you.
Thank you so much for coming along. It was a great turnout. We really appreciate you listening to us and giving us the feedback that we need so that we can continue to learn about what you need and come back with some value.